I'm Julia and I'm in recovery from addiction. I went to rehab a year and a half ago, and in this video we're going to be comparing my experience of rehab to John Mulaney's experience of rehab that he describes in his special Baby J. Baby J was just released as an album on Spotify, and so it popped up. I love listening to John Mulaney's old albums, particularly like the top part. There's also New in Town on Spotify. The rehab part of his special isn't the biggest part of the story, but I thought this could be an interesting comparison. So in the special, he talks about how he went to a detox part of the hospital and he went there for 4 days to detox. I think he must have gone to like, I don't know, a more professional place because he was on all of these drugs. He'd been awake for like over 50 hours, and he mentions Librium as the drug that the doctors give him at the rehab, which finally helps him to fall asleep, and that was also what I was given. I don't know how it worked at the place that he went to, because I'm sure there is some variation. We're also in different countries, so I'm sure there are differences there as well. Incidentally, John Oliver did a really good segment on his show Last Week Tonight all about rehab in America. I would recommend you check that out, so I will link that in the description if you want to watch that, because it's very interesting. John Mulaney talks about how he was in this detox hospital for 4 or 5 days. I was on my detox for 10 days. I don't know if he meant that he was just in a separate place or if that was the entirety of the time he was on his detox. It's clearly different depending on what you're addicted to, you know, what your body is physically dependent on. That's going to make a difference. People who are addicted to benzodiazepines, for example, their detox is longer than the one I was on. He talks about how he had a nurse in his room to make sure he stayed asleep. He had threatened twice to run away, you know, pretend that he'd fallen asleep and then he was gonna leave. I had this happen a few times as well, not because they were trying to keep me there, but just I think to like monitor you. It was actually quite creepy. You'd wake up, and the one I had, they would just like pop in to check on you every hour, so you couldn't lock your door. I'm surprised they even had locks on the rooms there, to be honest. But you could lock yourself in your room, but they would come in every hour. But I think that was also part of making sure that you were still safe. When I got there, they did some tests and my blood pressure was really high. Obviously, they're giving you all this medicine. When they gave me my meds, it was like 11 different little pills in the plastic cup. Some of them were just vitamins, particularly B vitamins. If you drink a lot of alcohol, you might need to stock up on B vitamins. I don't know why I'm saying that, I'm not a doctor. Because they were giving you this medication, and because I'd had high blood pressure, and I think just generally they would monitor everyone. That happened, so I related to that, and that kind of took me back. In terms of like the length of stay, said he was there for 2 months. I was there for a month, which makes sense given that he was on, I think like he lists 5 different things that he'd been taking. I'm sure there's a lot to unpack there. He also talks about how he started drinking when he was 6. So again, probably a lot more to unpack than I did. And not only that age gap, but also because I was younger. Like I had cemented some bad habits, but it wasn't like decades worth of things to redress. So I think that was helpful for me. Like I didn't need any more time. There was a point where I was going to stay for maybe another week, but in the end, like I've stayed sober since I left, so I clearly had enough time and have worked on my recovery since, so that's fine. He talks about Dr. Michael, which if you've seen the special, you will know what he's talking about. Watching it this second time, because the first time I was just watching it to watch it, like I didn't even know I was going to make a video talking about it. But this time, as I was watching it with a mind to creating a video about this topic, when he started talking about Dr. Michael, it just reminded me of the doctor that we saw when we were admitted. It was during, he also mentions how they weren't allowed any trips out because he went in, I think, did he go in 2020? They were stuck in there, which incidentally was the same for us. And I do wish that we could have had more outings. I mean, they did talk about like, oh yeah, you used to be able to like go to the shops and like, you know, pick up what you needed from the pharmacy in terms of like shampoo or whatever. That was all a no-go. We had like a walk once a day, and I did not realise that I'm really claustrophobic if I'm like stuck in a place and I can't leave. I guess maybe it's one of those things of like the grass is always greener, and because I knew that I couldn't leave this place and I could only leave once a day for a walk, that made it worse. But when he was talking about Dr. Michael, because I went last year and they were still very safe, like COVID safe with their precautions, they didn't allow any kind of extra staff, so I guess they didn't want this doctor just wandering in and out whenever. So the doctor's assessment and intake was done over Zoom on an iPad. The nurse is just holding up up this iPad and I'm talking to this doctor like, I don't know. The signal is bad in the room. The doctor is not like looking professional, you know, not like in a lab coat. I mean, I know they don't, if you go see the doctor, they're not, but I would have thought at least if you're working from home, maybe try and look more professional. This guy was just sat on his sofa in like a jumper and trying to like assess, you know, asking me these questions, which are obviously all very standard questions, so he was probably like, oh, there's nothing special about this. When I was watching and he's talking about Dr. Michael, and I was like, oh my gosh, no, I didn't have anyone like that before. But like the doctor I actually saw at the rehab, there was that kind of unreality to it, like the way he's talking about with Dr. Michael. He mentions how he turns up with all of this stuff because he's just been to see his dealer, and I was far more defeated when I turned up. You know, he gets there and he thinks he's gonna like smuggle all this stuff in because it's in the inside pocket of his jacket, and he's shocked that they know that that's a thing. I think it's quite funny. He says that pocket has eluded everyone in my life. That's kind of like a throwaway line that he does in the special, but to me I was like, oh, this is like an insight into like the more manipulative side of having an addiction. He's in that line saying that there have been times maybe where other people suspected something, his friends or family may have suspected what was going on, but that pocket eluded them, like they didn't look there, they didn't think to check there. So that was just an interesting line. That's a tangent from what I was saying. A difference there would be he was kind of not optimistic. I mean, he said he did a bunch in the car. I also did before I left, but that was more because I was at that point where I needed something all the time, which is why I needed to go to rehab in the first place. For me, it was more like almost had become like medicine, but like he tried to smuggle it in and I knew that wasn't going to happen because they search your bags as soon as you get there. Like they take everything. They would like go, I optimistically brought loads of books because I was doing my degree, so I was like, oh, I can read while I'm there and get some good reading done. I'll work during the day, and it was all the days were scheduled like school days, but I was like, oh, I can get some reading done in the evenings. No, it maybe in the last 2 weeks I could have done, but then it was more just we had like movie nights. I was not going to be reading like Sister Carrie. That just wasn't going to happen. When they were going through my bags, they were like opening all of the pages of the books, like flipping through everything. Like they were very thorough. Someone still did manage to smuggle some stuff in, which I still feel bad about the fact that I know that and I didn't say anything, but that's a whole other thing. Obviously no one, like I'm not anyone. I think it was funny how he was worried that people would recognize him, and then that worry shifted and suddenly he was like, oh no one knows who I am, and then he starts leaving the newspaper around. He said there's a newspaper with a story about how he's gone to rehab, and he's leaving this around like thinking, oh, other people will see this and be like, oh my gosh, this is John Mulaney, that's you, and like no one cared and no one said anything or no one saw it. And I think that's really funny because it's kind of like there's a saying, addicts have a ego the size of a house, self-esteem the size of a mouse, and that's kind of in that picture of him being like, oh, I hope no one knows who I am, and then get there and no one knows, and he's then like, oh no, they need to know who I am, like leaving the newspaper kind of this like, you can't win either way, there's something wrong, either like, oh, I don't want them to recognize me, or then like, how could they not recognize me? Another similarity was where he talks about writing out his life story. This is to help you process what's happened. It's kind of a wild ride to look back and realize how things started and then how it all got a lot worse. So I related to that. I also did that. And he talks about how there was lots of group work, which was the same for me. He says specifically that they would sit around and share stories of the most desperate things we did to get drugs. It's basically what happens. You need to face like all of the horrible stuff that you did. While it's tempting to think, oh, but that's not me, that was just drunk me, that is still a part of you. I don't know, this kind of makes me feel grateful to be in recovery, because like I can't pretend to myself that I'm a good person. Like a lot of people, I think, want to think that they're really good, and we will try and minimize the bad things that we do. But with this, there's so much that happened that I'm like, oh no, I'm not a good person. It like breaks through that illusion. It like makes you face yourself. I just read the A Court of Thorns and Roses series. There's a part where one of the characters looks in this mirror and people have gone mad from looking in this mirror. This is a spoiler, so if you want to read it, don't watch this part of the video. This character looks in this mirror. In it, you see who you truly are. So you see all of your worst traits, basically. And she looks into this mirror and comes out unscathed. Like she's wrestled with who she is. Like, she's cried and screamed and whatever, looked in this mirror, seen who she truly is, and then accepted that. That's how I feel. I mean, not like looking into the mirror part, but having to list all of these things, the desperate things, like he says, it breaks the illusion that you're a good person. Like, I can be a good person now, I can be nice now, but I'm not wandering around thinking that I'm such a great person because there's all this stuff that I did. And I mean, he shares his Rolex watch story, which I have nothing on that scale because he's talking about like tens of thousands of dollars, and he says how, however unlikable that story is, that's what I'm willing to tell you. And I relate to that a lot. There are so many things that I shared in rehab with that group of people, which I will never say to anyone again. Kind of related to that is the bit at the end where he talks about he's taken his son to this museum and he needs to change him. So they go into the men's room and he sees the baby changing station, which he mentions earlier in the special. And at the end, then he's saying, looking at it, and he's clean and sober and looks at it, it's like, ah, oh, hello, old friend. I just find that really funny. I mean, I guess I'm saying a lot of the stuff is funny. I think I'm saying that just because the flip side is that it's really dark. So I prefer to try and find some kind of lightheartedness in it, if that makes sense. I related to that as well. There are places that I walk past now, and I'm not talking about like bars or pubs, I'm talking about like specific bathrooms, like station bathrooms that I walk past and I'm like, oh yeah, like that used to be a thing. There were also a couple of bits which weren't necessarily to do with rehab which stuck out to me this time, where he says, I'm doing great now, but when I'm alone, I'm with the person who tried to kill me. That's kind of a creepy feeling sometimes. It's also a nice feeling. It gives me a strange confidence. Very much relate to that. I mentioned how I can't pretend to myself that I'm a good person. I can be now, but I can't pretend like I always was, or that I am as a whole person, if that makes sense. But there's this part of me that is very destructive in that way. And it can sort of feel like this wall of darkness, like staring at me sometimes. And like I said, I try and laugh, like I try and be like, oh, it's funny, but it just sort of feels like I'm sometimes laughing at it and it's just like waiting. He didn't say any of this in the special, but that was what was brought up for me. He links that to how he really doesn't care what anyone thinks anymore, because he's like, what's the worst thing that anyone can do to me? And he says, what is someone going to do to me that's worse than what I've done to myself? Which I think is a really fair point. Why am I scared anymore of what people think? It really doesn't matter. Incidentally, I've done a couple videos on my channel of how to stop caring what people think, so I will link one of them for you if that is something that you would like to hear more about. It was a different experience watching it. I did another video about this special, just a reaction video, which I will link for you if you want to watch. It was, thankfully this time, a lot easier to watch. I knew going into it the first time what it was going to be about, and I thought that that would make it really interesting for me because it's very relatable. There are so many parts of it, as we've just gone through, that I can relate to, particularly in this video with the rehab experiences. But the first time I watched it, it was really emotional, particularly the ending. I just sat there and was crying as the credits were going, and I was like, why am I having such a strong reaction to it? And I wonder if that was just I was having a bad day or I was just not feeling great in terms of my recovery. But I watched it this time and picked out like lots of different moments in terms of like a bit of a hopeful undertone, which I'd not really picked up on the first time I watched it at all. I guess there's different parts to focus on, right? And if you are going to focus on the darker bits or the bits which feel not necessarily bitter, but there are some instances where, yeah, maybe it is a bit bitter, the when he talks about like, oh, I have all these people who've saved my life. Like, you can view that, he's joking, but you can view that either in a lighthearted way or not. And I think this time, the second time watching it, I'm viewing it more in a lighthearted way, whereas the first time I was like, oh, is that like problematic? Is he being ungrateful, or is there something unresolved there? It's very hard to analyze any of this because you're not actually having a conversation. It's a performance as well, so you've got to bear that in mind when he's saying certain things, although it's clearly all from his own experience. But I'm a bit heartened that the second time I've watched it, I've had a much better experience. I was a bit like, oh, I want to make this video talking about rehab, but I don't know if I want to watch that again because I had such a bad reaction the first time. But no, I actually really enjoyed it. I would urge you to watch it if you've not seen it yet. I mean, I'm guessing you have if you've watched a whole video about John Mulaney now and it's special. If you've not watched it, yeah, watch it. It's on Netflix. When I saw it pop up on Spotify as just come out, I was like, oh, maybe this is my sign to talk about it, because there's so much. I'd done my first video and there was so much I didn't cover. Because there's so much to say. Like, I feel like I could make another video, make it like a trilogy of John Mulaney reaction videos. I just feel like I have maybe hopefully an interesting perspective to offer on this. I do relate to a lot of what he shared because I've been through very similar things. I will leave my other John Mulaney reaction video, I'll leave that on the screen if you want to check it out. I've also got a whole playlist of sobriety and recovery videos if you want to hear more about that topic. I will also leave the how to stop caring what people think video because I did mention that. God bless, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.